It's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. If it's Monday or Wednesday night, then it must be California Haunts Radio Night. Please take this time to gather some popcorn, hamburgers, hot dogs, maybe even dinner or whatever snacks you eat, and have a sit down in front of the TV, the computer, or even your cell phone and enjoy the show. Well, hey, good evening. Good evening, good evening. It's a great Monday evening, 95 degrees here in Sacramento, which is normal for the summer. At least we're down to 95. Anyway, it feels like spring. But anyway, my name is Charlotte. I am your host, and I will be your host for the next hour or so. And we've got a great show lined up for you tonight. This show is important. This is our 50th show in this format. Back in September, I decided I was going to do a video formatted show instead of a call-in show that we used to do on Blog Talk Radio. And I made that change, and it was huge for me and for the people that stuck with us from the beginning of, in the beginning. I was not used to being in front of a camera, so I had some growing pains. But I can honestly say we've come a long way since then. In fact, back at the end of March, I started to send this back out as a podcast. After every show, for people that don't know, I take the audio off of here and I feed it as a podcast, so that more people can hear it, can reach more people. And since March 30th, we are really close to 1,000 downloads on the show. Right now, we're sitting 34 below 1,000 downloads. So we're doing really good. The show's gaining momentum. It's because of you guys sharing it. Like the whole thing is to share it with 5 people. And more interest. But I'm really excited about tonight. My name is Charlotte, again. And I am the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento. We're 35 strong. We're located up and down the state of California, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and Hawaii. And if you need help, give us a ring, okay? Anyway, we got a great guest tonight. We got Joshua Cutchin. I've been wanting to talk with this gentleman for a long time. He has some different views on Sasquatch and even fairy folk. So we're going to talk to him and see what he has to say about that stuff. And I think you guys are going to find it really interesting, because the last time I heard him on a show, I was just absolutely fascinated by what he had to say. So without further ado, let me bring him on up. Hello, Joshua.
Hi there. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for that kind introduction.
You were just fascinating on the other, I'm not going to say which show, but the other show.
Okay.
And,
the show which shall not be named.
Yes, the competition.
Okay.
Of course, we can't compete with that anyway, you know what I mean? There's just
Okay.
no way. But I was glad you wanted to come on and talk about this stuff, because you had some really unique views on the Sasquatch that I never even thought about before.
Yeah, you're very kind in saying unique. I know some people think that I've lost the plot a bit. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting position. I have always tended towards being going against the grain with things like the extraterrestrial hypothesis for UFOs. Sometimes I even go against the dead people hypothesis for ghosts. But also, hand in hand with that goes sort of going against what my co-author Timothy Renner and I called the flesh and blood hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of an odd position because, Tim and I both very much believe that people see these things, and we believe that there are phenomena that leave impacts upon the environment that are very consistent with a large hairy primate. But at the same time, the skeptics make some really compelling arguments. Sure. So the question is, how does someone who's sitting in the middle of those two things, how do you reconcile that? And I think that the best way to approach it in that sense is from a more paranormal perspective.
Mm-hmm. So, how long did it take you to do this research, and to try and figure all this stuff out?
So, I usually it takes me about 6 months to a year to research a book, and then 6 months to a year to write a book. But I was under the gun for this one because I had two boys on the way, my set of twin sons. So I think I researched and wrote my portions of the book in about 6 months, which, it's 2 volumes, each about 80,000 words. So it's basically like one of my full books that I researched and wrote in that amount of time. But I think part of that was due to the fact that there really is no shortage of the sort of material that Tim and I wanted to cover.
Mm-hmm.
And really looking at, all the outliers that, they're the sort of outliers that puzzle a lot of cryptozoologists, and a lot of skeptics use as ammunition against the phenomena. And Timothy and I wanted to say, well, how do we reconcile these things? And in order to do that, you end up looking at things like Carl Jung and the collective unconscious. You end up looking a lot into folklore. You end up looking a lot into indigenous folklore as well. And it was really incredible to me how often find parallels to other sort of phenomena. I sort of joked that these books aren't really about Bigfoot as much as they're about everything else through the Bigfoot lens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bigfoot correspond with, old world witch folklore. How does Bigfoot align with fairy folklore, little people folklore that you see around the world? How does it line up with sort of what we see in hauntings, etc.? So that's volume 1 focuses on folklore. Volume 2 focuses a little bit more on evidence and some of the really confounding things that we see in a lot of these Bigfoot cases, like these oddly numbered toes on footprints, and obviously where the title of the two works come from, where the footprints in these trackways that just suddenly end in the middle of a field or something. The conventional cryptozoological explanation is, oh, well, the Bigfoot jumped, but sometimes these are really, really, really big fields where they should have, if Bigfoot can jump like this, it's the most amazing animal ever.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to other traits that it has that make it the most remarkable animal ever. So they'll say that, or they'll say that Bigfoot tiptoed backwards through the footprints, or these different things. And, I believe these are often anomalous trackways that people find, but to say that you've got a monkey that's tiptoeing backwards through its footprints, or that it's brushing out its footprint, it really is a violation of the true meaning of Occam's razor, which everybody says Occam's razor is the simplest answer is true. That's not quite what Occam's razor is. Occam's razor really is about not multiplying variables unnecessarily. And in the case of saying that there's a big, it realizes that it doesn't want to be caught and is going to tiptoe backwards through its footprints and wipe out its. it's just a little bit silly for me. And
right.
I realize that fully well, saying that I know that me saying things like portals or dimensions, or literally these things sort of dematerializing out of our physical space, or thought forms like tulpas and stuff. I realize that that's silly for some people too, but I think that it's a better fit for these phenomena that we're seeing personally.
Well, I always had a thought that, because if these aliens are doing tests, like they were doing tests like way back in the Egyptian times on us, with the abductions and everything. What if they were creating these hybrids, and that's what these things are? Is they're I'm not going to say mistakes, but maybe maybe it's the ones that that they just didn't quite get right.
Yeah, Bigfoot needs some love too, right?
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that so many of the things that we see cryptozoologists sort of having an interest in are sort of man-animal hybrids. I think that's really interesting. That says a lot, especially if you think about the role that what are called therianthropes play in a lot of major religions. Sort of like, so in case your audience doesn't know, I'm sure you do, but animal-headed deities, or people, animals that are half human, half animal. And I think that Bigfoot is a good example of something that could, with just a few tweaks, be something flesh and blood and quite real.
Right.
To say nothing of the fact that we have evidence in the fossil record for things like Bigfoot. Like,
right.
I'm pretty sure that Dogman is not flesh and blood. I'm sorry. like I can kind of firmly say that, because there's no real antecedent for it. So yeah, I mean, you might be onto something there.
Because when you think about it, and the more people that supposedly get abducted, they get taken, and they see the hybrids are looking more and more human. So I mean, it's not like they had the technology. I mean, even back centuries ago. Let's think like our technology. Okay, they had to obviously build up their technology just like we're building up our technology, and they didn't have the technology to make these more human hybrids at that point. So they were just starting out, and this is what happened.
Well, that is something that you see in the the alien abduction literature. You're looking at somebody like what's his name, David Jacobs, who was saying that there are alien human hybrids, and that over time they've gotten more and more human. They've been sort of the alien part's been diluted out of them to the extent that they're now hybrids. So I think that there's something to that, especially in the sense that. I think that it's a little bit foolish to separate the Bigfoot problem from the UFO problem because, as my co-author Timothy said, and I thought this was really quite prescient, he said two things which stuck with me. The first one is in response to people who have said, well, the aliens are just investigating the Bigfoots. Okay, so that's multiplying variables unnecessarily, right? But the other thing he says, okay, well, you don't see UFOs like investigating orangutans or gorillas, right? And the other thing that he said was, it's rare to see Bigfoot and it's rare to see a UFO for the average person, right? How many orders of magnitude rarer is it to see them close together or on the same night? I think it really does imply that there's a connection there. Now, your mileage may vary on whether or not that's like a physical nuts and bolts spacecraft or whatever. But I think that between that and a lot of these shared things between the phenomena, I mean, some of the two examples that I find really fascinating that I wasn't even aware of being an issue in Bigfoot lore are what I call the motif of the unwakeable spouse or the unwakeable sleeper, right? So the idea that you'll see this a lot of times in alien abduction folklore, but you also find it in like fairy texts from the 19th century where somebody, like in the case of the fairy text, a woman will wake up and see her child being taken away by the fairies, and she's trying to wake her husband up, and her husband won't wake up. The husband or wife will hear this sound, and they'll try to wake their spouse up, and they won't move.
Right.
I'll be darned if you don't see the same thing in Bigfoot stories as well. I can think of two examples. One of them was a researcher who had set up a perimeter around his camp, and for the express purpose of like being alerted if Bigfoot was in the area, and something that sounded a lot like Bigfoot with a lot of other Bigfoot-ish sort of phenomena around it. Tripped the wire, and he's awake, and he's trying to shake his friend awake, and he couldn't wake him up. Another good example was Doug Hajicek, who was running one of the expeditions up near Snowgrove Lake, I believe Ontario, site of a lot of Bigfoot activity. Said that one night he and his son and another researcher were in this cabin, and like the entire cabin was shaking, and there were things on the roof, and there were rocks being thrown at it, and he's freaking out because this is a place where people have seen Bigfoot, and there's all this Bigfoot activity, and he goes and he says he's literally beating on the other researcher to the point that he feels like he's hurting him, and the guy doesn't wake up until all the activity's over. Now, two things. Either he's lying, which I don't think he is. He seems to be a pretty credible person. Or he's expressing this other motif that goes back further and further and further. And I don't really know the guy, but I don't think that he's reading, Wirt Sykes's British Goblins from 1880, right? Right. So there's that fascinates me. That's a connection. And these are just two of like, I'm sure you listen to the interview. So like two of like, a dozen and a half connections that we can make. But the other one is missing time in Bigfoot encounters. You have missing time in Fairyland, where you go into Fairyland and you think that you're there for a day, and it turns out it's been a year. Or, in a lot of this UFO lore, the trip home that should have taken 30 minutes is missing 4 hours. You have no idea where that missing time went. There are people who encounter Bigfoot and have these missing time encounters. I thought that it must have been 5 minutes, but it was really 30 minutes, and it's like, that's not the way that people's perception of time works in stress, right? They tend to take small amounts of time and stretch them out. They don't take large amounts of time and compress them. So I think that's just really interesting, and it's one of those things, in addition to the fact that people just see Bigfoot on UFOs, in UFOs, coming out of UFOs, or they'll see a Bigfoot and they'll see a UFO take off above the forest. Not super common, but common enough that I think it's dishonest to just sort of hand wave it away as no connection.
Well, to kind of regress, too, on this, I've been thinking about this while I've been talking to you. I mean, it may not even been a fact that they were experimenting for the hybrids, because for those that believe in evolution, when you think about it, if they went, if the aliens went back to the time when the Neanderthals and all these things were on the Earth, and beamed them aboard, or took them aboard, and then wanted to try and make them into a hybrid, well, they're not advanced enough.
Well, or I mean, like if we're going to sort of go down that line of speculation, so I mentioned that there's things like Bigfoot in the fossil record, but nothing that seems to be a great match, right?
Right.
People will say Gigantopithecus blocky, but if you look at like depictions of Gigantopithecus and what they think it just looked like a big tired orangutan about 9 feet tall, who just like used to like just barely, not bipedal, right? Mostly a quadruped. But like if we're going back at that sort of a time depth, it stands to reason that they could have abducted, one of our ancestors hundreds of thousands, if not, well, I guess hundreds of thousands of years ago, probably. And they went on their own divergent evolutionary course that we didn't take,
Well, yeah, and then you think about that, how our evolutionary process worked, too.
Right.
To learn fire and all this. Well, I mean, maybe there was some help.
I think that even so, here's my thing. I'm not really big onto the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I tend to think that a lot of the things that we see in the UFO literature are, I don't want to say spiritual, because that makes it sound like I'm pushing everything that's like some sort of Judeo-Christian sort of thing. But I do think that they tend to look a lot more like myths come to life in a lot of ways. But having said that, regardless of whether or not you're on the nuts and bolts spacecraft with flesh and blood aliens train, or you're on sort of my train, it really is a similar idea. You have this intervention of species from off planet as sort of helping us out. And honestly, I still don't think the idea of panspermia has been discredited. In fact, I think things like Oumuamua from, what was that, 2-3 years ago, suggest that it's entirely possible, if not likely, that that's how life gets seeded across the universe. But also, you can look at mythology and these sort of themes that we have of what could be called civilizing tricksters, right? So you've got a classic example is Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to bring to mankind. Right. And is that is that a poetic version of the way that we discovered fire? Is it a literal God coming and bringing that to us, or demigod, I guess, or is it a metaphor for extraterrestrial intervention?
Right.
Yes, all the above. None of the. I mean, all of it. In some ways.
This is fascinating to me. I mean, to talk about this, and I remember listening to you on the other show. We were talking about you were talking about orbs in the forest.
Yeah. So this is something that I suppose that the origin of this project, because this was kind of Tim's baby, but it kind of came together. I think Tim might have gotten the idea because we had both contributed to David Weatherly's third volume of Wood Knocks, which is a collection of Bigfoot essays. And my essay was about something that we can get to later if you want to, but
sure.
The idea of the intersection of poltergeist phenomena and Bigfoot phenomena, what people associate with those two things. But that, I think, in and of itself, was kind of inspired by my good friend and host of Where the Road Go podcast, Soraya Azkath, who said that the thing that tends to link all these phenomena, in addition to, honestly, poltergeist phenomena or some other things, but like one of the things that appears in practically every paranormal topic are these balls and orbs of light. And it's so much of that is really context dependent, right? By which I mean that you see a ball of light in the sky and you say, oh, it's a UFO. And you see it in a forest and you're like, oh, it's, the good folk or, Bigfoot. We can
it's the
put a pin in that. Or, you see it in a haunted house and it's a ghost, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, these balls of light, these orbs, these ghost lights, whatever you want to call them, or even earth lights, because there are some indications that they could be produced by natural tectonic stress and things like that, have a very high incidence to appear in areas with Bigfoot activity. And I think that should raise, again, as we were talking about before,
Right.
the rarity of these things. That should raise some questions for some people. And it's something that we really talked about that much, even 5 years ago, you know. But there are some individuals in the field who have started talking about it. I attribute rather Wes Germer from Sasquatch Chronicles, who started talking openly about this, seeing some lights at the same area where he had his encounter, and then just collecting stories from people of the same thing. Yeah, it's one of those things that if you get the flesh and blood Bigfoot proponent to the bar after the conference, after their presentation, and you get a drink or two, and they're like, "Yeah, we went on the expedition to this place that has a lot of Bigfoot activity, and we didn't see any Bigfoot that time, but we saw these ghost lights." There are even stories of Bigfoot like holding or capturing these orbs, or Bigfoot turning into these orbs or coming out of these orbs. And by Bigfoot, I mean like a catch-all for giant hairy hominids the world over.
Right.
There's I think some cases in the book from like the Philippines where when you saw a Bigfoot. I love this story. Bigfoot, this big hairy. Okay, not a Bigfoot because it's Philippines and it's culturally dependent, but you get my idea.
Right.
A Bigfoot shrink until it was so tiny, and then it popped into a light orb, and then it just sort of drifted off into the sky. You know, the subtitle of the books are High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomena, right? And I really do have a strong love for those high strangeness cases, those strange dream logic things that you find in these accounts. Because, man, if I'm going to make up a story, I'm not going to include that goofy stuff, you know.
Well, when you think about it, a lot of the UFO photos that came out early on, like back in the 70s, were all out of the Philippines.
Yeah, it's a section of the world. There's ufology, to go off on a minor little tangent here, has some real blinders on, and like I'm part of the problem too. We get a lot of cases from North America. We get a lot of cases. We actually do a pretty good job with South America, primarily Brazil, but South America in general. Europe got that covered. Australia got that covered, but Asia, outside of like maybe Japan and Korea, there's just not a lot of data. And Africa is just a complete black hole of UFO knowledge in terms of what gets passed along to the West, or probably also what Westerners focus on because of implicit biases. But there's a lot of strange things that happen in island Southeast Asia, and if anybody's interested in sort of following up on that, there's a great researcher who does not get enough love named Ahmad Jamaluddin. I can't tell you how to spell his last name except that it starts with a J and it ends with D-I-N. But he's a great researcher who's been doing some very important work quietly in the background. And some really strange UFO flaps and little people sightings and spirit phenomena and even their own sort of, wild men in that part of the country as well.
So when you talk about Bigfoot, you're talking about, maybe he's coming through maybe a portal or something like that. Like you say, I mean, they can't walk backwards, obviously, over their footsteps. Their footsteps need to disappear.
I mean, they could be doing that. I don't know. I try to picture that in a world like, let's really simplify it. Like in a world where there is nothing paranormal, because that's kind of the buy-in, right? Or at least that's what the flesh and blood cryptozoological community wants you to believe, right? There are no ghosts, nothing paranormal. It's all a bunch of fossilized or creatures that should be fossilized, right? In that scenario, I have trouble believing that. But it's not just that. I have trouble believing that they do that, and that they are the world's best mimics, and that they're the world's best jumpers, and that they have self-illuminating eyes, and that they can stay so still they appear like logs, and that they have infrasound. Like it's like, if we are to believe every explanation that the cryptozoological community trots out, it's literally the most. It's like the most or the best in like 15 zoological categories, and that makes me kind of go, well, are we dealing with Oh, sorry. I think we froze there for a second.
Yeah, that's okay. It's kind of funny though.
I know, right? I interrupted you, and we froze. I jinxed it.
I was just waiting to see if you came back. I was just thinking about that, what you were saying, and it's like anything else, like mythology, with stories passed on through the ages. The story starts out a certain way, and then as it's passed on from person to person, it gets more and more, exciting. Yeah, and maybe this is what's happened with Sasquatch over the years, that these stories have been passed down, and then somebody adds to them, and somebody adds to them, and somebody adds to them.
Like a game of telephone or something, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where I think that I probably part ways with a lot of people who are just honestly looking at this sort of like some sort of ghost phenomenon or something. Like, I kind of think, and I've been thinking about this a lot, I kind of think that the line between fiction and reality is a lot more permeable than we do. I mean, if you look at indigenous cultures, some of them don't even distinguish fiction from fact. And I'm not saying that in some sort of like artsy fartsy postmodern sort of way. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I put a difference between imaginary and imaginal, and by which I mean, I've used this example some. Patrick Harper wrote Demonic Reality, one of, I think, the best books on the paranormal. And at one point he talks about how, for example, in a movie or something, you could be watching a movie about two fictional people in a fictional relationship, but like the way that the relationship plays out and the emotions that you feel are like the truest thing ever, right? And I think that, if you look at that through the lens that parapsychology is providing these days, that our minds can influence in some ways, that makes the whole idea a little bit easier to swallow. I mean, because I heard this recently. I don't know if I'm sort of asking around about this because I'm trying to find out if it's true, but I think I heard somewhere that the first incident of a car being stopped by a UFO, by the engine going dead, appeared in fiction.
Oh, okay.
And if that's true, at the same time, I have to reconcile that with the fact that I do think that there are UFOs that are stopping people's cars. So is there some sort of phenomena that's playing with our expectations, So as people are, as you say, perhaps sort of embellishing the Bigfoot story as it goes through, perhaps there is some sort of other intelligence that sometimes wearing the mask of Bigfoot, sometimes wearing the mask of little people or UFOs or whatever, that's not sort of seeing our expectations and going, oh, this is what humans, or this is what this other consciousness, I guess, expects from me. I'll sort of adjust accordingly to fit that. Because otherwise, I think a lot of times you run into this problem of, it's all bunk, or every idea is absolutely true, and I just it's a weird place to be.
Well, yeah. It's nice to talk to you because you look at this stuff logically. You're looking at this from a different perspective.
Well, just I appreciate that. It's kind of funny. Like there's been a big kerfuffle over the past 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks or so, about the Travis Walton case, famous alien abduction case, and about whether it's true or not. And I'm where I kind of come from is I don't have a lot of skin in the game. Like, okay, it's not true. All right, moving on. Like there are 1,000 other cases that I think that are true. So what difference does that make? But also, for me, it's the expression of these myths. For example, in the Travis Walton case, I found an incident of a 16th century individual who was abducted by the Wild Hunt. The ghost horde that traveled through Europe, and it's beat for beat the Travis Walton case. He goes to a forest and he hears a buzzing sound and he's transported somewhere, and his cousin is accused of murdering him, and a couple of days, 4 weeks later, he shows back up and he tells this story about what happened to him. And the way that appears again in the Travis Walton story is more interesting to me than this, binary yes or no, Travis Walton was lying or he's not. That to me is the interesting part. And I'm sure that being like I'm at this point in my life where I'm really envious of ghost hunters because
Right.
I want to do a lot more of it. But I'm sure that you've seen this too, like where ghosts will sometimes, like, people have genuine ghost sightings, but they conform to things that people are expecting. You know, like I think about like what is it, the Myrtles Plantation?
Yes.
Yeah, I can't remember what the slave girl's name was, slave woman's name, but like there was never a slave by that name and of that description, but people still see it, and enough people have talked about seeing that people actually do see it. And we're not talking about mass hysteria here. I think that there's generally something to the phenomena reacting to people that way.
Oh, I agree. There's a place up, and I can't remember, called Latitudes up in Auburn up here that's had the same issue where there really wasn't anything in there, but yet paranormal group after paranormal group go in there and they're picking up EVPs because everybody wants it to be there.
Yeah, and you know, I sort of alluded to the psi psychic sort of component earlier, but I think that there's a lot of power in that research that's out there. I'm talking about people like Dean Radin, Daryl Bim, and Rupert Sheldrake, people who are doing, especially in the case of Dean Radin, some really well laboratory controlled experiments that are proving that, you know, the human mind can affect things just beyond, you know, 50-50 chance, which, you know, I think has all sorts of implications for how we influence and interact and the reality that we have around us.
My father always had a saying, you know, if you wish long enough and you hope hard enough, you know, and you just sit there and dwell on it, it will come true. And that was his saying always. And I think that kind of goes into some of these paranormal sightings as well. You know, I really do. Just like a lot of the TV shows, everything's negative on these TV shows. I get phone calls every day with people, it's a demon in my house. I know it's a demon in my house. So I'm like, well, how do you know it's a demon in your house? Oh, because I know. And it's like, well, have you been watching TV? Well, yeah. Well, we don't know what it is, you know.
Or I mean, like, it started out neutral and you're watching TV and you're feeding that whatever it is, you know.
Yeah.
It comes down to me, like, I remember I'll have conversations with people about, like, you know, something, and they'll say, oh, it's just placebo, and I'm like, just placebo is such a loaded term. I can't believe that we gloss over that as a culture. Like, the idea that your mind can make associations and have a certain attitude that can physically change your entire attitude is just, it's wild. Or, you know, on the reverse side of it, and the nocebos, right? People who are told that they're cursed and then they get self-fulfilling prophecy. That to me says that we're embedded in some sort of reality that really, really responds to the way that we think and that we frame and that the energy that we put out, honestly.
Right. Now, we were talking about Bigfoot, and you mentioned poltergeist activity around Bigfoot cases.
Yeah, so I don't think this is something that I know for a fact that this is not something that I was the first person to notice. But, like, whenever I'd come across people talking about it, it would be like a paragraph or a sentence or something, and then they'd move on. So I'm like, let's look at this a little bit more closely, shall we? Which is the fact that a lot of Bigfoot activity is a perfect fit for poltergeist activity. Like, if you take what the BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, calls Class B reports, which are the reports where everything happens except for Bigfoot, right? So you've got rocks thrown, you've got voices, you've got bad smells, you've got, like, footprints, you've got
banging on the trees.
Yeah, banging on the trees, raps or knocks, right? And you take all that and you put it in a forest, and it's Bigfoot. But you take that exact same suite of phenomena and put it into a house, and it's a poltergeist case, like 100%.
Yeah.
You know, items misplaced or moving, like it's a 1-for-1 comparison, and it obviously we've seen primates throwing rocks and things, and it's entirely likely that might be a primate that's the source of that in the woods. But I find some of the parallels really interesting. One of the more interesting parallels is that in the Minerva monster case in Ohio in the 1970s, very famous case that was chronicled in the first Small Town documentary by Seth Breedlove and company. There were the brothers who were at, you know, ridge behind their house where they'd often see the Bigfoot as the Bigfoot was like, seen around this town, and they'd see this figure stalking the ridgeline, and they'd throw rocks up, and one time they even marked the rocks with an X, and they threw it up, and the rocks were back to them. But the rocks were warm to the touch when they held them, and that's, yes, it could be a Bigfoot holding it in its hand, right? But it's also the exact same thing that you see in poltergeist phenomena, where these items, these apports that happen, rocks that just appear in the middle, that drop from the ceiling that no one can see, actually are filmed sometimes with thermal imaging, and they'll actually see it start hot and then slowly get cooler. So there's things like that, but there's also like the things that you don't normally hear about in Bigfoot reports also happen in. Sorry, the things from poltergeist reports that you don't hear in Bigfoot reports actually do happen in Bigfoot reports, is what I was trying to say. I'll talk about one famous example after I bring something else up.
Okay.
What I just said also can be said vice versa, by which I mean people have reported big hairy animals during seances. So the two places that you see poltergeist phenomena are, hauntings generally associated with a prepubescent teen or something.
I don't know. If I saw a big hairy thing during a seance, I'd be out of there, boy.
I know, right? It would be. Well, first I'd soil myself, and then I'd be out of there. But yeah, the second place that you see it is in seances. These spiritualist seances is where you see poltergeist phenomena, and couple of different documented cases that I found of people like literally seeing like an ape man, or seeing a figure that was either covered in furs or something. But this is in addition to like dozens of stories of people being grabbed by hairy hands in seances. So even if you're in the woods and you see a hairy hand reach out from behind a tree, can we? Is it Bigfoot or not? I know, right? Or a hairy hand reach into your tent. Yeah. There's a great story of a sailor on a fishing vessel who was like eating a sandwich late at night, and he's got the porthole open. He's like, I don't know, like 100 yards out into a bay or something, and this big hairy hand reaches in and grabs a sandwich. Like the idea of this Bigfoot swam across, but no, not for me. But another case where circling back around to what I mentioned earlier.
Sorry, I threw you off.
Oh, no. You're fine. This is just the way my brain works. Mentioning, poltergeist stuff that you don't hear about happening in Bigfoot reports, happening in Bigfoot reports. Classic example of sort of why I think Tim and I should have written these books. Somebody should have written these books a long time ago. Is the Ape Canyon account, and account, is one of the ones that cryptozoologists like to trot out all the time about, these big monkeys, basically, that assaulted a cabin near Mount St. Helens in Washington.
Right.
And they're reaching, they're miners at a mining camp, and they're shooting through the holes in the log cabin, and their fingers are reaching in, like they're throwing rocks at it. You hear about it all the time. Like, I would say if you're going to include like the top 5 most harrowing Bigfoot accounts, right? You're going to include that. But one of the few people that ever really recorded the incident was Fred Beck. And Fred Beck lived a very strange life, according to him. And that strange life extended to the Ape Canyon incident in ways that we don't normally associate. According to him, they were guided to the mining claim by a spirit that he called Vander White, this spirit lady. They were guided there by a flying white arrow in the sky.
Wow.
Once they got to the Ape Canyon site, they were hearing strange noises from underground. One thing you'll hear one thing that does appear in even the more conventional retellings of the story is that as one of the miners took a pot shot at a Bigfoot, and that's sort of that instigated all the violence. But they also found a pair of footprints, just left foot, right foot, in the middle of a sandbar that was in the middle of like a river with like 60 yards of untouched sand all around it. I think the quote at the time from the folks that were with Fred Beck were that it looked as if someone had dropped something from out of the sky and picked it back up. And then, the poltergeist stuff. Fred Beck claimed that at the Ape Canyon cabin, he had a pencil materialize in his hand in a port, and it was a pencil that he knew was like he had left back home, I believe. So you have all this weird attendant phenomena that sounds much more like what you'd find from, honestly, kind of like a theosophical text or something.
Yeah.
And I don't think. I think I asked someone if they thought the dates lined up and that Fred Beck could have actually been a theosophist, but I can't recall. But yeah, it does imply that we should be getting our peanut butter mixed in with our jelly a little bit more, because to silo off these different categories, oh, you deal with ghosts and the Bigfoot people are crazy, or I deal with Bigfoot and the UFO people are crazy. Like, it does seem that these Venn diagrams, if they're not a perfect circle, have a lot of overlap. Like more overlap than they don't. Yeah.
Yes. See, I've always thought, I started to think after reading that book, The Abduction in the Mojave. And it got me to thinking about what I do, because when they were talking how the aliens can materialize through walls and all that, and I thought, well, maybe we're not hunting what we think we're hunting. Maybe we're actually communicating with these hybrid aliens or these aliens.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit biased right now because the project that I'm working on is sort of rounding the horn on it. I'm about, I would say, 70% done. Is looking at all these different phenomena through the lens of it all having to do with death, right? Mm-hmm. So I kind of wonder if death is just such a big question mark, and I am a Christian and I have my beliefs, but I'm a weirdo Christian, and not by practice, by choice. And I think that we have so many questions about what lies just on the other side of that barrier, and the idea that it's some sort of other world populated by things that look like Bigfoot and that look like aliens and look like all sorts of things is not out of the question. There are so many. It's like a fractal, right? There's so many different options that you have. Like, are you hunting ghosts and contacting aliens? Are you hunting ghosts and contacting alien ghosts that are now untethered from time and space? It's just or are if you're familiar with those remote viewing experiments that were done in the 70s, I think it was. I always get those guys mixed up. It might have been Hal Puthoff. It might have been Ingo Swann. It was one of those guys, right? One of the remote viewing guys talked about viewing a colony on the moon, and they actually could see like he got a reaction from the moon people, right? Which I don't know if that's the case, right? But it does beg the question, because some other remote viewing results actually had some actionable intelligence that was military. So it implies that there's some sort of reality to it. What if UFOs are aliens remote viewing us? Like, it's not a craft; they're projecting their consciousness here to watch us. There's so many more, and that's part of why I enjoy sort of poking the bear of the establishment when it comes to the stuff, because there are so many wild and rich different ways that we can look at these things. And you're thinking right there about when I'm on a ghost investigation, am I contacting aliens? Is another idea that's it mixes my chocolate and my peanut butter, and I love it. I love it.
Well, that's the thing too, because a lot of the EVPs we get sound, a good majority of what people don't realize. Sure, they sound somewhat human, but they're always whispered, like they're way off in some other dimension. They're some of them are mechanical sounding. You get the mechanical voices. And it makes you wonder whether or not it is this alien thing where you're going through these dimensions.
That's a great point. And then you look at the robust channeling history that is channeling gods and dead loved ones and Ashtar Space Command and all this different stuff. I think there are even some there are some sort of channeled Bigfoot texts that are out there. And I'm not saying that everything is true in that sense. I'm saying that everything not contradicting what I said earlier. I'm not saying everything is true. I think that everything can influence the way that we see these things in reality. But I'm not saying that like people are contacting Ashtar or whatever. But again, it's a consistency of these beliefs that's expressed time and again that I find really, really interesting. And yeah, ghost hunting is not as cut and dry as people want to think it is by any stretch of the imagination.
Absolutely. I have another question for you too, real quick. These guys that have gotten Sasquatch voices, what do you think of that?
I don't know. You know, I mean, so we're talking about not Ann Slayton, Al Berry and Ron Moorhead's Sierra Sounds that they got at the Sierra camp. I think it's like 40 miles of hard road from anywhere, like really remote. And they got they left a recorder out and they got some voices that sound really, and they were analyzed by U.S. Navy cryptolinguist Scott Nelson, who said that he perceived the building blocks of language, which are terms that you use if you're in that line of work that I'm gonna make myself a fool if I try to remember what they're called. But basically there was some structure to it that was indicative of a language, not a known language, but it had the sort of syntax and whatnot. And there are individuals who are sort of voice or vocal forensic sort of individuals who said that, you know, the human voice can't make these sounds. I don't know. I think somebody really talented could. I can be goofy and sort of make the same noise as myself to a degree. And it's not like I'm, you know, practicing them every night either, or I am. Don't tell anybody. But you know, so I think that they're really interesting. I think that it's two things from that I find even more compelling are the fact that you'll talk to people or hear reports from people who have never heard those recordings, and they'll say, "Oh, they're almost always described in the same way," to varying degrees of you know, offensiveness, as like samurai chatter or Russians speaking backwards, or I heard one person say it sounded like a drunk deaf Amish man or something, but like again, like I said, to varying degrees of offensibility. But there's always sort of like there's typically a sort of reverse or gibberish component coupled with people describing like an Asiatic language. Typically, they'll say Japanese, Russian, Chinese. And yeah, when you listen to the recordings, you can kind of see why they'd say that. And people say samurai because it's by saying that you can get this sort of guttural quality that you associate with all those Akira Kurosawa films and, you know, and the Japanese language. So I mean, I think that's interesting. I don't know. It implies to me that people who've never heard those recordings report that. But I had a friend, Ren Collier, who asked me one time, he says, "Josh, have you ever considered how much those recordings sound like barbarous words?" I'm like, Ren, I have no idea what barbarous words are, so you've got to explain that to me. And it's could be equated with kind of speaking in tongues, in some of the, you know, the I guess Pentecostal traditions, but it's also, you know, a very common thing in magical practice where you'll get these texts that say, "Oh, these are ancient, you know, ancient Hebrew words that have been lost to time, or ancient Lemurian words, or any number of things." And really, what it is typically a translated Middle Eastern language of something. But there's plenty of made-up words. It just sounds like, you know, it sounds real-ish, right? And it sounds very close in terms of a description to what those barbarous words sound like. And coming back around to what Tim and I kept on finding in the research is that everything that you see in the Bigfoot lore has some sort of antecedent with primarily European wildman myths. You know, even when you would find it in indigenous lore, there'd be, people said that in the old world about wild men, and these wild men were never imagined as big monkeys, right? These wild men were always imagined as magical beings, as almost like, you know, sort of fairy folk kind of beings. And one of the things, in addition to everything else that we found, size shifting, shape shifting, living underwater, like weird outliers in Bigfoot lore you can find in these old wildman legends. And one of the things that you could find in the wildman legends was them saying that, oh yeah, wildmen could speak, but it was an incomprehensible, made-up language that sounded like gibberish. It's like, well, it's a pretty good description of the Sierra sounds for sure.
That's interesting. Very interesting. Let's talk about fairy lore a little bit.
Yeah, it's I don't know why I got so involved with that. But for some reason well, as my co-author says, a friend of his told him, I follow the things that hum. And for me, fairy lore hums, I guess.
So what have you found out? I mean, there's obviously fairies out in the woods. You got your wood fairy, you're right. So you tell me.
Well, so I don't think people sort of get this a little bit confused, because I am at the point now where I can't separate the alien abduction experience from a lot of this fairy lore. I just can't, because I would place a bet that anything that you find in alien abduction folklore has at least a vague antecedent in fairy folklore. And I even mean stuff like implants, like, in alien abduction lore, a variation of that shows up in terms of the fairy blast. Ships in the sky, all these things, missing time. It's just it every single aspect is mirrored. And if you use the associative property, if Bigfoot share a lot of things with alien folklore, UFO folklore, whatever that is, and that's shared with fairies, then by the transitive property, Bigfoot share a lot with fairies, and they do. All those alien similarities between fairies and Bigfoot they're shared by all three. But also, you can't overlook the fact that there was, the Wadwos, which was kind of like a wild man, but was regarded, again, not as a big monkey, but as sort of a fairy folk. And it was a tall, hairy, shaggy being. You even look at the descriptions of some fairies. We tend to think about them being, in their little vests and their little hats. And, you do find some descriptions of that. But with some of the fairies, especially the household variety, like brownies and some of the French goblins and Picamderlin in parts of Germany, I believe, were described as like little tiny hairy creatures with these monkey faces. And there are sightings of these Littlefoot, sightings of little hairy people. This is something that the people will say, oh, it's a juvenile Bigfoot. Well, maybe, but it sounds just like these other descriptions. And they're contemporary, and by contemporary I mean like the 1950s and such. Descriptions of people who still see these little hairy creatures and say, oh, it's a fairy, because they'll see them in the British Isles, or they'll see them in Scotland or something. And of course, the biggest part that people have trouble with associating Bigfoot with fairies is the size, right? Because Bigfoot's gigantic and fairies are small, but fairies are size and shapeshifters, and you find stories of Bigfoot being size and shapeshifters, especially in indigenous American lore. So that's not really that much of a barrier to sort of thinking about them both the same way, to say nothing of the fact that giants and trolls are fairy folk as well. And Bigfoot sounds a lot like a giant or a troll. So you have all these things, then you have these other really specific details that I find really interesting, like the braiding of horses' manes, which, believe it or not, some people claim that Bigfoot likes to steal into stables and braid horses' manes at night. Now, I think that a lot of these are people who don't brush their horses' manes, but it's a thing. It's a thing in the Bigfoot community. Like, you can find tons of people talking about this. Some of the photographic evidence is more believable than others, right? I have found a report of a Russian researcher who says that he saw an almasty crawl into a stable one night and braid its hair. He watched this Russian Bigfoot braid a horse's hair, right? Don't know if that's true or not, but what I will say is that in Europe, that was the exact same thing that they'd say fairies would do. They'd sneak into the stables at night, they'd braid the horses' manes to make stirrups, and they'd go out riding with the goddess Diana or whatever. Same thing with witches. They'd say witches would braid horses' manes too. So that to me is almost what I find more interesting than, the objective reality of any of these things, is the way that myth is transmitted through time. to these beings that we believe, you know, live around us, that share the land with us. So I mean, there are lots of different points of comparison that you can make between fairy folk and Bigfoot, to the extent that, like, you know, Bigfoot's kind of a big fairy, and people will get people will get frustrated because they'll think I'm saying that all these things are fairies, or that, you know, all the fairies were aliens, and I don't mean either of those things. I said this before, but I think that fairy folklore is a very consistent body of folklore to view a lot of basically most paranormal entities through. But having said that, I don't think fairies are aliens, or aliens are fairies, or Bigfoot are fairies. I just think they're all imperfect ways of describing the same phenomena, and they're all trying to get at the same thing. It's like the blind man and the elephant, right? You know, one holds the trunk and says it's a snake, and one holds the ears and says it's flatbread or something. You know, I think it's more akin to that. But there's a lot of cross pollination there for sure.
Have you seen those photos from many years ago, supposedly of fairies?
The Cottingley fairy photographs.
Yes.
Yeah, they're charming. I love them. I think that if memory serves, I think the girls said they were all fake except one photograph, which was like, that's a weird claim to make, right? You know, you think that you'd come out and say they're all fake. Apparently the girls said that they actually had interactions with fairies, but wanted to prove the adults wrong. So that's when they made the cutouts. And in case anybody's listening, you can look them up. Cottingley fairy photographs. They're still out there. Fooled Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Of course, he was very eager to be fooled. You know, the photographs. It's so frustrating. I don't know about you, but I just don't look at photos of Bigfoot or videos of Bigfoot or anything, because like I don't think we're going to get any answers to any of this stuff anytime soon. Again, not that I don't think these things are real and genuinely anomalous, right? I think these things are real and they don't fit into our idea of how the world works. Like, I think they're a warning that our world doesn't work the way we think it does. But you know, I think that Bigfoot's always going to be blurry, because I think that sits behind this phenomena has a way of making sure that it's pulling the strings and will never be outed unless it wants to, which I don't think it ever will.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why, you know, a lot of people, you know, a lot of the complaints are, if there's so many sightings, why hasn't anybody gotten a decent picture? Yeah,
and you know, I heard, okay, so it's a couple of things. Number one, you've got the idea that there's this sort of narrative, or this sort of, there's a possibility that there's some sort of power behind the scenes that can pull every string that it wants to, right? A. B, it takes me a long time to get so A, that. B, it takes me a long time to get my camera ready, right? Phone ready. C, a lot of people, when you see stuff, you're just like gobsmacked. You can't even, you know,
right.
If you're really that terrified, which a lot of people are, last thing you're thinking about, right? And then I had somebody at a conference who was like, I say this lovingly, a cat lady, right? And she said to herself that there was one of her cats that she had never gotten a photograph of, even though she tried, because it was always, every time she get that camera ready, it would just bounce right away. So I thought that was a really charming way of saying that, you know, yeah, just because we have the technology to capture this stuff doesn't mean that we have the ability or the foresight or the opportunity to, you know. And, you know, if anybody's ever taken a picture of like the moon or anything, like a plane in the night sky, like it always turns out like garbage.
Right.
Yeah.
And then when you think about it, if you do see something like that, you're scared. You're going to hold up your cell phone, your hands are shaking. So it's not going to be a clear photo no matter what you do, you know?
If you have steady hands to begin with, like my hands shake.
So do mine.
Yeah.
I'm a photographer, and I have to do that whole human tripod thing because I cannot take night shots for anything.
Oh, well, so yeah. Well, so I'm in good company then. Yeah, I try to take a picture of like a passage from a book, and it always comes out blurry, and I'm like, okay, great.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, where do you see the future of Bigfoot and fairy research going?
Staying the course, honestly. You know, I for the same reasons that I was sort of cynical about the whole UFO release, I think that these phenomena, by which I mean everything, ghosts and Bigfoot and fairies and aliens. I think that they are traveling companions with humanity, and have been forever and will be forever. And I think that they're not going to be put into a bottle. The only thing that might change is you might get more people to believe in it. But as far as like ever having a smoking gun, I think the very nature of it's sort of baked in to always remain ambiguous and marginalized. I think the phenomenon is in complete control, as we sort of alluded to, of people's perceptions, and I think it kind of likes being in that space. So, I think that Bigfootery specifically I think it's actually going in a really positive direction. I think ufology is going backwards. So I got into these topics actually relatively recently. Like 2015 was my first book. But even in that amount of time, I've seen the UFO topic become much more open to ideas of altered states of consciousness and these sort of highfalutin ideas that I've been talking about on this show. And then I think with a lot of the sort of recent interest in UFOs, it sort of slid back into those old nuts and bolts sort of ideas, right? It's little green scientists here who are tagging us and releasing us. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you have to explain why people see dead loved ones aboard spaceships and why people have profound synchronicities in their lives and stuff like that, right? But Bigfootery, I think is still going in a really positive direction because, again, in a much shorter amount of time, people are talking about the weird stuff. Timothy and I expected to be roundly attacked for this book, and there have been a little bit of griping here and there, but for the most part, it's been really welcomed by a lot of people in the community with open arms. I feel like a lot of people have felt like they can finally talk about some of these outliers. So I think that the Bigfoot community is a lot more open to these ideas, and you can talk about the sort of paranormal ideas now without being considered a complete buffoon. And I think that's encouraging because if you believe a witness when they say that they saw a big monkey cross the road, and you write that down and you're happy to get that account, and then they add into a flying saucer, if you believe the witness, you believe the witness. I think that it comes down to that. If a person seems credible and their story seems credible up to a certain point, but then they just go in a direction that you can't abide, I just don't know how conscience write them off completely.
You must have had mounds and mounds of research to go through to write these books.
Yeah, it's a couple of different things. I have a pretty healthy library. I am a child of the internet in a lot of ways, and by that I don't mean that I'm necessarily taking data from really shoddy or sketchy websites, but like Google Books is amazing. Archive.org is amazing. There's some really great resources for finding, actual scholarly, well-researched texts. So there's that. There's also a couple of online academic journals that I have access to. I have access to. I'm still close to my alma mater, which is having access to a university library that you can go to is a great thing. And then I do have a bunch of books and paranormal podcasts. Like I will always be indebted to paranormal podcasts of all sorts because I listen to them nonstop, by which I mean like literally not like nonstop in the car, mowing the lawn, playing video games, like whatever I'm doing, right? And in the shower. And invariably, once a week I'll find something from some show that resonates with something I'm talking about. So it's a huge component in my research as well. But yeah, I sort of have a reputation for a lot of endnotes and big bibliographies. So yeah.
That's the thing. I could talk to you all day.
Well, likewise, this has been very pleasant.
It's been so fun, Yeah. And I would love to get you on again if you're willing to do that, because there's so much more, you've written about, and I'd just love to go over that stuff with you.
Oh well, I am really passionate about it, and yeah, we'll have to do this again. I'll try to be a little bit better with communicating next time.
It's all good. So how do people get a hold of you, or where can they find you?
My website is joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN. There's some blog posts up there. It's real infrequent because I tend to focus on the long form stuff more. But I do keep up to date on
all my interviews
Okay,
are
cool.
all logged there, as well as links to all my books that you can just go through my website. And if you can get stuff from brick and mortar stores, that's great. I prefer that because I love myself a good bookstore. But if you have to go through one of the big online booksellers, I understand that is a matter of accessibility too.
There you go. Thank you so much, and let's schedule another show.
Absolutely, let's do it.
This was terrific.
Thank you.
I had a great time talking to you, and yeah.
Likewise, and congrats on the show blowing up. It's good news.
We're doing it.
Yep.
All right, thank you, Joshua.
All right, take care.
You too. All right, guys, that was a great show. It was a lot of fun, and wow, I can't wait to get him on again to talk about some other stuff, because he's got some other interesting books out that just knocked my socks off. But shifting gears a little bit, tomorrow we're gonna put my news hat on, and we're gonna have a lady on who is a counselor for people going through grief, and she's got a proven technique to turn your grief into a positive thing. So we're going to be talking with her tomorrow. Anyway, if you liked tonight's show, share it with 5 people. If you didn't like tonight's show, share it with five of your enemies. That's how we're getting the word out. That's how we're getting this thing built up, little by little. Boom, 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 boom. It's getting bigger and bigger. So again, share it. Share. And if you want to help us out a little bit to stay on the air, because the paranormal group itself is nonprofit, so all this comes out of pocket, you can help us by a donation, to keep informative guests coming to like Joshua. Donate to paypal.me at California Haunts, and I would be eternally grateful, and we can keep things rolling. But anyway, I want to thank you all for coming, and I will see you tomorrow at 6:25 p.m. PDT. I love the whole PDT. And I'm also going to let you know, we're going to show Joshua's website again, his books, so you guys have an idea of the books he's written and what I'm excited about. And, yeah, here we go. That's websites, facebook.com/Cutchin and joshuacutchin.com for the websites. Books available on his website. You can also hopefully get them on Amazon. And one of the books is Thieves of the Night. Brimstone Deceit, A Trojan Feast. And of course, Where the Footprints End, Volume 1 and 2. So as I said before, have a good evening. I will see you here tomorrow. Bye-bye.